Welcome to a Northern Monkeys datasheet review. This time we're looking at the Redemptor Dreadnought to see how we can get the most out of it on the tabletop. So this is a 210 point unit for Codex Space Marines. Very expensive, it's over 10% of your army if you're playing at those big 2k games. But honestly, really worth it. Now, stats wise, his toughness 10, which, is better than the Melter strength. So you're always going to be, some things are going to be wounding you a lot worse than they could be. And he has a 2+ armor save, which is really good because it means if you can get cover with him being a vehicle and you use armor of contempt, even things like las cannons, you'll be still having a really good save against, like a 3+ armor save against a las cannon, which benefits him greatly. And he's just got sort of those layers of defense. Between that armor save, it doesn't really matter that he doesn't have an invuln, because he'll always be getting a fairly decent save. He has 12 wounds, which is a lot. He has 4 OC, again, more than your average vehicle. And also that Duty Eternal rule, absolutely massive. -1 damage to everything allocated to him. Really nice. Because a lot of 2 damage stuff like Plasma is in the meta, anything that's like flat 3 damage for killing all those big chunky infantry models, they're just a lot less efficient against this guy. And in terms of his actual output, he's great. He kind of, in the early game, he'll very much be a kind of your push forward, try and hold objectives kind of threat. But what I like about the Redemptor is the amount of shooting he has. He has the Macro Plasma or the Onslaught Gatling Cannon, which are both, fairly fine weapons, but one's better than the other. And on top of that, he just puts out like dozens of smaller shots, some of which have devastating wounds, some of which have anti-fly. And it's just that really good combination of volume and quality that I think really lets you get value out of this datasheet. So a few other things to note about this guy. The recent changes to Oath, where if you're in generic Codex Space Marines and you get +1 to wound against your Oath target, is pretty massive for this guy. His old letdown used to be that his Macro Plasma, while very good, was only strength 9, so a lot of vehicles, like the Redemptor Dreadnought, who are toughness 10, he'd be wounding them on 5s. Now with Oath, rerolling all your hits on that good volume that you've got, you also get +1 to wound, so he can really tear chunks out of enemy vehicles. Don't forget, this thing's AP 4 and a flat damage 3, so it's very powerful against enemies like that you want to be just taking chunks out of. And your Oath of Moment target, why don't you want to be shooting that, And it's the perfect kind of thing where it's a big enemy vehicle that you can draw a line of sight on. This thing's 36-inch range, so that's not really going to be a problem either. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with putting his plasma cannon into some like big enemy target and then putting all of his little guns into some chaff that you want to clear. He's kind of very much like that. He's a multi-phase unit where you kind of want to be getting the best out of him in every possible activation that you can. So yeah, definitely consider that. And his movement 8 and his round base, which for those who don't know, the round base lets you kind of pivot around for free. It makes him surprisingly nimble, which is good because you can get him into combat. And he does chunk there, 5 attacks, strength 12, so he'll be wounding most vehicles on 3s. It's only AP 2, but flat damage 3. It's decent. And don't forget, with his toughness 10, he makes a pretty good tank shock target as well. So you can really, you move this guy up against an Oath of Momented vehicle, you blast it with your Macro Plasma, take a load of wounds off it, you then shoot all of his little guns into some chaff unit and destroy them, and then charge in, tank shock, and then fight with your fist. You can really take a massive bite out of really high toughness targets. And that's kind of what the Redemptor's good at, apart from just being an absolute tank on the battlefield with his high toughness and his -1 damage ability. It can be really effective. Now, discussing his loadout, I feel like there's a lot of options for him, but I personally really like the Plasma. The big Gatling cannon is fun. It always gets to, getting to roll a load of dice. However, it's just kind of like he's got a lot of little guns anyway, so do you really want to add to that? Maybe you can as a dedicated chaff clearer, but I always feel Marines struggle more to find anti-tank than anti-troop in terms of their firepower, so I've always preferred the plasma cannon just for that reason. And as well, with it being D6+1 blast, you can actually get a fair number of shots out of it. If you're all lucky into like a big 10-man unit of like Plague Marines, or even just a big unit of Death Shroud or other kind of high value stuff that you want to be shooting with that plasma cannon, you can be easily getting 7 or 8 shots, which is pretty good considering their quality. The rocket pod, you always want to take that because it's free. Why would you not want to take that? The Gatling Cannon's great. Some people play the Heavy Flamer on him, but I think the Gatling Cannon's just cool for the dev wounds, just being able to chip away at targets, and the longer range. And then, personally, I prefer the Fragstorm Grenade Launcher, but that versus the Stormbolter, it's kind of, neither here nor there. So yeah, the loadout I'd recommend's on the right there. So I've recently played this guy in a couple of games, sort of put him on against some pretty tough matchups, Dark Angels and Death Guard, and honestly did absolutely amazing work. A lot of people sort of say, oh, it's not worth the points, but I really think as long as you're careful in your deployment and kind of positioning of him, even if you bring him out like turn 3, once you've dealt with a few sort of key enemy threats, he is really, really worth it. And the Armour of Contempt nerf hurts him a little, because he does rely on that for durability against high AP stuff. But if you can kind of use his fast movement and his long range to kind of get those angles, then it's really, really good, because you can kind of take out key threats to him, and then in the late game he just becomes a bully who like storms into the centre or holds the enemy objectives down. And with OC4, he's not very bad at that at all. One thing that I noticed, just sort of anecdotally, is anything where if your enemy unit has 3 wounds and 2 damage weapons, he absolutely bullies them. Like, he just shoved these Death Shroud Terminators around. He, even with the anti-vehicle 3+ that they had, he wasn't really scared of these Deathwing Knights, because, like, sure, they're -1 damage on him, so he's a little less efficient into them, but all their swords suddenly become 1 damage. Lots of units, like even very elite units like these Terminators, they simply don't have the firepower or the amount of attacks required to crack the Redemptor Dreadnought, even over multiple turns. So, yeah, I think as long as you can just focus on that, eliminating the key threats to the Redemptor before you have to commit them too hard, then I've found that they have great value, and they are very much just like a kind of a bully unit. I can imagine taking a few of these and trying to sort of like amplify this tactic. So in terms of which detachment you want to be putting your Redemptor Dreadnought in, I think he's very much typical kind of like of all Marines, in that he's a little bit good at everything. He shoots chaff, he shoots elites and vehicles, he fights decently, he's relatively tough, but you pay a points premium for that. So you definitely you can go in all the different detachments, is what I'm trying to say. You definitely, like, almost all of them benefit him, because he does everything that you're wanting to do in the game. So yeah, I'd rate him in almost anything. Like, I don't think any Marine army is kneecapping itself by taking him, even some of the more obscure ones. Because even without detachment synergies, he's still like a decent unit that can get a lot of value, especially with the new Oath of Moment. Now, Gladius, that's typically what I run, and he's really, really good in Gladius. You've got the Storm of Fire stratagem, which essentially gives him ignores cover and +1 AP if you're in the Devastator Doctrine. I often find that, like, I'll use the Devastator Doctrine to get the Redemptor's firepower into the proper positioning, because it gives him advance and shoot on his guns, which is really, really good. His movement 8 plus a d6 advance, you're moving this guy like 11, 12 inches easily. Really, really good. And all of his little guns getting an extra pip of AP and ignores cover, it synergizes really, really well, because you're just chipping through Marine saves, you're taking away guard saves entirely. So he's very, very good into all those targets. And the great thing about Storm of Fire is there's no like, oh, you must target one enemy unit with it. So you can pop Storm of Fire on this guy, have all of his guns shred a unit of chaff, and then have like an AP5 weapon going into a enemy vehicle. So, I mean, literally an enemy 2+ armor save unit that uses Void Armor or Armor of Contempt and has cover, the Macroplasma will strip it down to a 6-up save. It's pretty much as good as you can get it. AP5 ignores cover. Now, Ironstorm Spearhead as well. This is typically like the home of vehicles, and I think this is a really, really great place for your Redemptors. They like the rerolls from the detachment rule. Just gives you reroll a hit, a wound, or a damage. They don't need the damage reroll, but you're always wanting to reroll those Macroplasma shots that you rolled a 1 to wound on, stuff like that. So he's very much at home in the Ironstorm Spearhead detachment. And now the Ancient Fury stratagem, though he can't benefit from the save bonus for that, because he's already got a 2-up save, all the other buffs that stratagem gives him for the turn, like the extra OC and the movement and the hit, Really, really nice. Like, the Redemptor's good enough to take advantage of that for sure. And one that's a pretty scary combo, even though it's expensive for 2 CP. There's the Mercy's Weakness, which gives him sustained hits and crits on 5s if he's a vehicle. Really, really nice for the Redemptor, because it just lets his sheer amount of shots and high quality plasma and things like that, like, absolutely destroy enemy units, presuming you roll well on the number of shots. And you can combo this with the enhancement Target Augury Web, which gives the vehicle lethal hits from a Techmarine. Really, really nice, because all of a sudden you're hitting on 2s because the Techmarine's buffed you. You've got lethal hits, you've got sustained hits, and you've got crit 5s. I think the Redemptor Dreadnought is one of the vehicles that's sort of powerful enough to be worth spending all these buffs on. And it'll really give your opponent a problem in dealing with him. Just because it doesn't matter that his plasma cannon doesn't have the best strength or AP. You just, well, sustained hits, crit hits on 5s, lethal hits. You know, you're just going to put an insane amount of damage through and potentially one-shot a vehicle if you get slightly lucky. So usually at this point in the video I discuss what leaders you can put in when I'm discussing an infantry unit. Obviously, being a vehicle, he can't have that. So I thought I'd talk about to Techmarine or not to Techmarine. Do you want a Techmarine escorting your Redemptor Dreadnought? Is it worth a sort of an include when you're thinking about the Redemptor? Now, I think it's very much a, do you have the points for it in your army? The Redemptor's already expensive. Having a Techmarine help him, you know, makes it up to, like, I think the package costs 265 points. But I think genuinely he is a vehicle who it can be worth just having a Techmarine hanging about and helping him. The combo of getting the +1 to hit for the Redemptor, it can really help him. If you're not going into the Oath target because you don't have an angle or you want to be firing somewhere else, hitting on 2s is a really, really nice buff for him. He's got, like I said before, he's got enough volume for putting these buffs on him to be sort of worth it. And the Techmarine following him around, the Techmarine has anti-chaff shooting with his Forge Bolter, or whatever his, like, kind of shoulder-mounted gun is, so he can contribute to, like, the same targets as the Redemptor. And the Redemptors get lone operative following a vehicle around. So if you kind of, you know, say you want this Redemptor to just hold your expansion objective because he's tough enough to do that, your opponent can't really whittle him down over a few turns. You know, like, oh, send in a unit with grenades, fire a couple of las cannons at him, and then next turn you send in a big chunky unit to try and finish the Redemptor off, because the Techmarine will just constantly be healing the Redemptor back up. So it's a really, really good thing to have that. I mean, you're having to get through the 2-up armor save, the toughness 10, the -1 damage, and then all of a sudden you're healing the unit that your opponent's shooting at. It can be a real head scratcher to deal with if they don't have something really, really big to just one-shot the Redemptor, which is a fairly rare thing in the game. Now, if the Redemptor's being a lot more bullish and just kind of running up the mid-board, there is a chance he'll get the Techmarine that's following him killed. But by the same stretch, the Techmarine can easily sort of buff the Redemptor and send him off and just get the job done that way, and the Techmarine goes off and buffs other vehicles once he's buffed the Redemptor. So that's a pretty good combo. And if your opponent does, like, heavily commit some, like, big powerful melee unit into shooting and killing the Redemptor, then if the Techmarine was nearby, he gets bonus attacks. So that's really, really good to, like, have that kind of counter punch coming out of the Techmarine. So yeah, I really, really like it. I think it's worth having a Techmarine if you're running a Redemptor. However, it's not necessary because the Redemptor's such a beast all round. So thanks for watching. First vehicle datasheet we've reviewed. I don't tend to play as many vehicles in 40k. I'm very much a, like, MSU infantry. That's kind of my play style. I just prefer painting them as well, which informs a lot of my army choices. But I got a Redemptor Dreadnought sometime in 9th edition and didn't regret it. It's an absolute, like, workhorse of my army. Really, really like him. So I hope you enjoyed this content anyway. Like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments any particular datasheets you'd like to see reviewed.